On Baha'u'llah's first day in the Garden of Ridvan on April 21st, 1863, he made three transformative statements. They're only in two paragraphs, and they're in Days of Remembrance, section number 9, page 38. But I think it'll take us countless generations to put them into practice. The first statement was that the law of the sword hath been annulled. And my understanding of that is that all weapons for spreading religion have been annulled. This actually harkened back to 1853 when Baha'u'llah was imprisoned in the Seer Shal in Tehran, and he had the vision of the Maid of Heaven who said to him, "Verily we will render thee victorious by thyself and by thy pen." So going back 10 years when his dispensation began, it was clear that the cause of God in this day was to be spread by words and by deeds. This is quite different from the history of religion, because previous to this dispensation, religion was forced upon people. Now we know about jihad and how Islam was often spread by the sword. Not as much as sometimes the Western world would have us believe, but nonetheless. And we know that the Inquisition burned people at the stake. The Catholic Church did back in the 14th, 15th century for heretics and apostates. Now, an apostate is someone who has renounced the religion that he was raised in. So we know that this also was enjoined upon Jews in the book of Deuteronomy. They were told to stone apostates to death, and Protestants did this as well. But what's really fascinating to me about apostasy being punished is that basically religion was saying, don't investigate the truth. So even though Jesus has told us the truth shall set you free, religion until today did not want its followers seeking the truth. So even today, Baha'is in Iran are put to death. Jews and Christians in Iran by Shiite Islam. Jews and Christians are marginalized and considered unclean by Shiite Islam, but they're not put to death because their religious dispensations preceded Islam. So it's not as if they rejected their childhood religion, but because the Baha'i faith occurred or began after Islam, Baha'is are supposed to be put to death in Iran. So this notion of force, however, Baha'u'llah applies to all affairs, all human affairs. Tradition is one way in which force is enjoined upon people. So, for example, many of us are ostracized if we change the religion of our ancestors. Even marriage, if you try to marry outside your religion, your race, your caste, that also, tradition is a way of forcing people to do things, not to use their mind or their heart to examine the truth of what they believe, to follow whatever religion might be their convictions, but to hold fast to the accident of birth that was the religion in which they were born. And of course, we know this was also true, how tradition even forced professions upon people, going into the family business, so to speak. But, if your father was a carpenter, then you became a carpenter. If he was a wheelwright, you became a wheelwright. But now in this day and age, since Baha'u'llah says the independent investigation of truth is the first principle, tradition can't force religion. So you can be born into a Baha'i family, but you can't be born a Baha'i. In that, you can be raised in a Baha'i household with those principles, and God bless you. But at the age of 15, and you become the age of maturity, you're responsible for your own spiritual being at that point. And so, one can't be forced to go to feast or to fast. Of course, this puts more, I think, pressure on us as parents for those first 15 years to set the good example by the child hearing us praying and seeing us fasting and teaching the faith, so that they'll want to do that, rather than the parent forcing religion upon the child. So in a sense, with force being annulled, violence and anger as a way of settling disputes has gone by the wayside, because we're rational beings. Our soul is a rational soul. And so, as opposed to using our animal force, we're now being told that the culture of contest is over. Just as I think wars would be looked back upon and people would just shake their heads that rational souls would conduct wars, the way we sometimes look back at duels and think how nutty that was. When Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel by Aaron Burr, we look back at that now, and perhaps one day we'll feel the same way about war. So maybe the culture of contest can go by the wayside the way the generation gap did. When I was a teenager, there was a clear generation gap, and we don't even talk about that so much anymore. In any case, war, however, isn't just, or I should say world peace, for example, isn't just the absence of war. It's an action. And so what will replace that force, according to Baha'u'llah's teachings, is the diplomacy of consultation. And because if you go let's say you go into a peace march, if you're angry, well, you're really causing war. So you might as well stay home, because attitude is activity. And so the action of consultation, the action of embracing the culture of love, the action of embracing human rights, of appreciating the diversity of opinions as well as of races and cultures, all of this becomes the action of world peace. But Abdu'l-Baha points out that women will be the direct cause of world peace. And this is very interesting, because to my understanding, when human beings were hunter-gatherers, the male was ascended because of his aggression and physical strength. But when human beings became farmers, the feminine qualities of nurturing, of receptivity, became ascendant. And farming has been the basis of civilization. So it seems then that the feminine qualities are the ones that will bring about peace. And, the cooperation that a farmer has to have with the weather, with the soil, with the seeds, is more impacting than the competition that came from the hunt. And so Abdu'l-Baha says, and I'm quoting him now, he says that women are superior to men in terms of tenderness of heart and abundance of mercy and sympathy. And that the equality of men and women, this is not a quote now, but of course it comes my understanding of what Abdu'l-Baha had to say, that bringing women into power in masculine roles is not so much how women and men will be equal as it will be that we make feminine qualities more valued and ascendant in society. So the annulment of the sword is that annulment of force, and once again, how the culture of contest has come to an end. So the second statement that Baha'u'llah makes on that first day in the Ridvan garden is that no manifestation will come until 1,000 years at least have expired. That the successor to Baha'u'llah. Now, we can think about this in terms of the future. In fact, I think we often do, and wonder about, no one's going to come for 1,000 years. And since we're not going to live for 1,000 years, we don't think it pertains to us so much. In fact, we could feel pretty good about ourselves, since according to progressive revelation, we've recognized the latest manifestation of God. But we can't get too smug when we realize that a more inclusive term than progressive revelation that this statement implies is that this statement implies a historical consciousness. Namely, implicit in the statement that another manifestation will not come for 1,000 years is that Baha'u'llah will be succeeded by another manifestation of God, that dispensation will end. And no other religion has ever talked about its end. Certainly Christianity and Islam have not. They certainly don't talk about the end of their holy book. But historical consciousness really does mean that although the spiritual teachings remain valid from the gospel, from the Torah, from the Quran, the social teachings are subject to this progressive revelation, to history. Just as everything else in nature is evolving, so does Scripture. And so I think that there's a dynamic change implicit in this second statement that rejects the man-made doctrine of the finality of religion, that there's a continuity. And I think we can see this in the names of the first followers of the Bab. He referred to them as letters of the living. And that's distinctive from the dead letter of Revelation in the past, in that it would end, as Muhammad was said to be the seal of the prophets. But now, if that second statement about no messenger will succeed Baha'u'llah, at least for 1,000 years to pass, that also pertains to the past, not just to the future. So doesn't that imply then that we can't feel too smug if we don't have a consciousness of the past, if we're not aware of the religions that have led to this stage, if we're not aware of the Gospels, if we don't study the Quran, to do the best we can? And that's what I meant when I said that these statements to me are a creative impulse that may take a long time to enact, because it also calls upon me to be familiar with not just the history of the Baha'i faith, but the history of those other religions and of mankind in general. Now, the third statement is that all the names of God have been fully manifested in this day. We talked about this when we were analyzing the Ridvan tablet. And I think what helps me to understand how all the names and attributes of God are manifest in this day, that we have the potentiality for the first time to reflect the image and likeness of God, that we have the seed of all those attributes of showing justice, of kindliness, of chastity, of mercy, that we have the seed to not simply be in the age of becoming, as was the age of prophecy, but as Baha'u'llah says in the long obligatory prayer, that he has joined the letters B and E together, that we can be those attributes of God. So that third statement, that they all have been fully manifested in this day, is that full potential is within us to manifest, as I say, the image and likeness of God. And what I find really fascinating is that we talked about the tablet of Job that Baha'u'llah revealed in these early days in the Ridvan garden. And he was enjoining patience upon the friends in that tablet, the way Job had patience. And so we have to have patience with ourselves. We have to have the internal discipline where we don't want to use the force that he annuls in the first statement. But we have to have the internal discipline to be patient with ourselves, to be patient with raising our children, that we don't attempt to force a religion upon them, and also, in a sense, to be patient with all our fellow believers, as Baha'u'llah enjoined upon us. And so, once again, the way I feel these statements will take a long time to put into practice, if we consider the calendar, for example, every day and every month has one of these names of God, one of these attributes. The new Baha'i calendar, the Badi calendar, is reminding us that we have to inhabit the calendar, that we have to inhabit these names of God. And so instead of saying Monday and Tuesday, we now say Jalal, Jamal, all these names of God. And we're responding to the revelation that there's an interaction going on with these names of God. We're the mirrors, or we're meant to be the mirrors of these attributes of God on this earthly plane. So I think that becoming, that now is being, religion is now living faith, and that this evolution, this progressive revelation, is actually an active evolution. Just as peace is an action of peace, consultation, embracing diversity, embracing love, and so that this nearness to God that Baha'u'llah talks about, that we can attain by mirroring the attributes of God, he tells us with this statement that all nature, that all creation is sacred, is divine. There are no strangers. There are no untouchables. There are no outcasts. There are no apostates. Not only are all human beings sacred and divine with this potentiality of having all the names and attributes of God within them, but so too is nature. So how can we destroy nature? So there's an environmentalism implied in this third statement by Baha'u'llah. As Baha'u'llah said on this day, all created things were immersed in a sea of purification. We're given this clean slate to etch all these attributes of God upon our being. Now, in case we doubt that, on the very first day of this dispensation, of the Babi dispensation, May 23rd, 1844, the day in which all things were made new. And it requires a bit of reflection on my part, and I think on all of us, to understand the relationship between the Bab's revelation and Baha'u'llah's regarding the impetus for all things reflecting the attributes of God. But my point is that on that night of May 23rd, 1844, Abdu'l-Baha was born. So the moment that all atoms were given the potentiality to reflect all the attributes of God, a perfect exemplar, perfect human being, if you will, was born as a living example of this possibility. So we're being enjoined to pay attention to what we can do to create peace, to manifest the attributes of God, and that's the intention with our attention, to create the paradise that is Ridvan. And so let's conclude with some words of Baha'u'llah about our being mirrors of these names of God. The world will pass away, and so will all the things whereat your hearts rejoice, or wherein ye pride yourselves before men. Cleanse the mirrors of your hearts from the dross of the world and all that is therein, that they may reflect the resplendent light of God. Rejoice in the gladness of thy heart, that thou mayest be worthy to meet me and to mirror forth my beauty.